All right, everybody ready?
Good morning, everyone.
It's about that time. Okay, so we're going to get started here. I think before we even begin, I kind of want to get a sense of who we have in the room. So raise your hand if you're somebody that works directly for a government organization, either a GS or as a contractor. Okay, and anybody else, everybody else on the private sector that's done work with the government. All right, first, we're going to,
the Lone Ranger over there.
We'll be speaking directly to you. Well, awesome. Thank you all for coming. We're glad to have you. So today we'll be talking about walking you through a case study and just ways to approach digital strategy with large government organizations, especially considering where we are in the landscape as far as people having multiple sites and there being a real push in trying to make things much more user-centric. And we're going to give you just a little bit of information about some of the things we experienced with a couple of clients that we've worked with. And so a little bit about who we are, both as an organization and as a people. So we are all with U Group, and these pretty faces that you see here today is who we are. I'm Jabali. I'm the Director of User Experience. Clay, who's the Vice VP of Technology, and marcrambeau, who's the Associate Director of User Experience. Our Twitter handles are unavailable. All right. You want to talk a little bit about U Group and who we are?
We were all part of Chief, which maybe many of you have known or heard of before. It's a DC agency that's been around for a while, involved in Drupal as well as just brand and identity work. Recently, we merged with a company called ByteCube. ByteCube is a more heavily technical engineering software company out in Crystal City. So we merged about a year ago, and just this January launched ourselves as U Group and focused around human-centered approaches to technology.
Awesome. And these are basically capabilities, again, expanding on what we previously had, which pretty much largely falls in the experience and potentially consulting sections of the site. It really was an opportunity to bring everything together and take the strategy, the process, and marry together with the complex technology. And I think that's a lot of what also leads to our capabilities, our ability to do the digital strategy that we're talking about here, where we can both have the conversation to do all the understanding, but then have enough expertise within house in order to be able to analyze the technical complexity of the back-end systems that people are working with. Awesome.
So one of the things that we started this, the project we're going to talk about, for the most part, we started over a year and a half ago, and most of the work we were doing there just happened to come around to fall in quite a bit of alignment with what was just signed over in January or in December of the 21st Century Idea Act. So a lot of what is in that is really related to the work that we were doing. There's some key areas that primarily are, of course, interest stuff, and things that we've always been focused in with our work, and within any federal agency has been sort of focused on working themselves. Any new redesigned public digital service, which we're in the middle of some right now, any new ones start, require to be accessible, consistent, consolidated, searchable, secure, mobile-friendly, and hopefully task-oriented, but mostly designed around user needs. It's one of the most important aspects of this act is a actual legal foundation that it has to be supported by quantitative and qualitative research in any of the work that we're doing. So there's a real focus on what it means to finally ensure that any of our products we're creating and actually putting out there's a digital service of one of the agencies now is actually centered around actual user needs. And data-driven analysis influence. So all the things that we've been for many years trying to encourage and bring into any of the work that we do with our agency clients as well as our public and commercial clients is to make sure that we are following here what we see here: qualitative, quantitative data, determining user goals, needs, behaviors, and continually test and then create that feedback loop where we continuously improve the deliverables that we're putting out there.
All right. Can you all hear me if I don't use the mics? Am I going to get dinged for not
using the mic?
For not using the mic? Okay, great. I want to be able to.
Have to use the mic.
Do I? Oh, I want to be able to use the space a little bit. But here, why don't I? Okay, how about that?
I'll mind using
Perfect.
the space.
Well, in any case, I'm going to have to raise these up a little bit. So we want to walk you through a little bit of a case study to give you a sense of what exactly we mean when we talk about user-first digital strategy for federal agencies. We've had a long-term partnership with a fairly well-known federal agency. We won't go into details about which agency that is. You may pick up some clues along the way, but some of this work is still ongoing, so we want to be sure we're mindful of our clients' needs and confidentiality. But the lesson here is that this particular agency faces many of the same challenges as the ones you're probably facing in your own agencies. These are common problems. This agency has an important mission and an important responsibility to the American public to serve citizens. But it also has requirements, enforcement and regulatory responsibilities that it has to meet. And what that means is that it's serving several different audiences with really varying needs. And what that has led to over the years is some perhaps confused priorities, some crossed wires. And over the course of 20 years, the agency has developed and launched over 20 web properties, 15 of which are still live today. So there's a lot of sort of siloed action here from office to office, depending on the priorities of the day, the priorities of the administration. And this web ecosystem has grown organically over time. It also means that given the regulatory and enforcement responsibilities of this agency, there are over 110,000 pages and documents live on the web across these properties. It's a massive, massive, massive ecosystem of content that can be really difficult for folks on the ground to wrap their heads around. So, given our past relationship with this client, we recognized an opportunity here. The challenge is that this web ecosystem is designed around the organization, not necessarily the needs of the public, as is sort of required by the IDEA Act. Now, to hit back on those IDEA Act requirements, we were seeing problems on every single one. Accessibility issues. Web developers within the agency were creating custom pages that weren't 508 compliant. We had, across 15 plus properties, we had very inconsistent brand and visual identity. There was a lot of confusion among users, potential confusion at least, when we entered this exercise as to sort of who this agency was and what their mission was. Obviously, lots and lots of duplication that grew up thanks to that siloed approach, underperforming search, an aging technology stack. Several of these sites were on Drupal 7. Not all of them. There was a variety of the technology environment was varied, as Clay will get into a bit later. A lack of mobile responsiveness. A content structure around audiences and the organization itself rather than around user tasks and needs. And there wasn't much coordinated strategic planning or analysis and testing. Some of these properties were using 4C. These quizzes hadn't been updated in years. There was occasional analysis happening, but it was one-off. It often wasn't looking over time, and it made effectiveness hard to measure.
The one thing we'll add here is that this is consistent across all of our clients. Yeah. Like, this is not uncommon. This is not something related to a single agency. We've seen this across the board and not just all our federal agency clients. I mean, we've seen this from some of our state agency clients, and as well as, depending on the size, but we just recently did for a law firm a consolidation of 10 different blogs that they had written into a single system. It's just what happens is people's needs are sort of focused and siloed. They say, I need this site, and they spin up a new site, and then end up creating a situation where we're in here where we have to then bring it back and refocus what that strategy is, or should have been.
Right. And one of the ways I actually always normalize this when we talk to clients is that this problem is really born out of kind of the age of web and where we are, right? You got to the point where at some point having a website was really just about disseminating information. Like, I want access on information, and then as a different branch of your company said, okay, well, I want my information out. My information is a little bit different than theirs. My users have needs, and for a long time, for about a 10-year cycle, everybody everywhere will then add another one, will then add another one, and will then add another one. So we're at that point in time where people are starting to look at it and say, wait, what do we even have? The amount of governance for when sites are created, how they're created, whether or not there's a standard across. has kind of gone off the rails, and we've allowed people to work in autonomy, which was ideal at a certain point in time about 5 to 7 years ago. And I think a lot of the trend is starting to come back where people are saying, let's start to analyze what's happening and bring things back into, because audiences now have they have 1,000 different devices, but they have much more access to everything at one time. And so a lot of it has to do just simply with where we are at the moment in time.
Right, and that really speaks to our goal walking into this engagement with the client. Given our longstanding relationship, it was already time to update the technology stack. But what we recognized was that this was an opportunity to rethink the strategy and to take a step back and, from a 30,000-foot level, look at whether these properties were all serving the agency's needs as best they could, whether they were serving user needs as best they could. And our goal was to produce a strategy, a roadmap for a reimagined ecosystem that would achieve those goals in a more effective way.
So this is, as you mentioned, this is an opportunity where the relationship that we have with the client started to shift. And again, when we talk about sort of just where we are in moments of time, there's also places where people have, as a lot of you work for the government, you definitely understand where the contractors you're working with, you kind of have a dev maintenance contractor, somebody who helps you update your site for a long time. The person responsible, the company responsible for making updates to your site and keeping it, doing any back-end changes to it, was basically all the web changes, all the person that you had doing any web maintenance at all, and the strategic parts of it wasn't necessarily something you were asking for from that agency. So we looked at this as an opportunity to really bring in the other parts of our internal departments in to really make sure we engage that client, and took a moment and put a pin in time to say, let us really understand what you're trying to accomplish. Before we do this again, let's stop and see what you're trying to accomplish, where we think that there are inconsistencies across understanding, and where the digital landscape is serving each of the individual groups within your organization. And then let's also talk to your audiences. And so we really wanted to create basically a three-prong approach, which is really business goals, user needs, functional requirements, and analytics in order to, like, just general overall web audit, in order to understand what the current was and how we could really improve things in a really strategic way, so that all the decisions we were making moving forward for our relationship were really steeped in research, thought, and really also focused very heavily on user first. And so it gave us an opportunity to really introduce our client to different parts and different ways of working, and that was a great transition of the nature of the relationship. And so for the first stage, this is very important. We always start with engaging stakeholders. There's always a piece when, especially when you're talking about UX, a lot of UXers are going to look at things and say, I just want to talk to users first. I want to understand what the audiences need. And one of the things we haven't been doing for years is talking to audiences. Why do I need to have another conversation with the stakeholders? But the reality is, in a lot of situations, people also haven't had those collective conversations across the stakeholder groups as well. And so as much as you would think that working with an organization, what everybody thinks it needs, those conversations are happening in pockets. You don't always have access to everybody. So we wanted to make sure that we scheduled a couple of different activities in order to really bring those things in. And so when you see one-on-one interviews, we had upwards of 35 interviews with individuals across the organization. And something that's very important here is, we helped them by giving them guidance around the type of people we wanted to talk to, because the natural tendency was most important people. I want the folks who were going to have the strongest opinion about whether or not this project moves forward. So they tended to want to give executive level department heads, but some of those folks don't really use the website. It really was somebody else in their team. So we wanted to basically make sure that we had a diverse group, and told them when we're looking for who we're interviewing, we need something that is a complete cross section of both breadth and depth, and high to low as far as seniority across the site, because we want to get genuinely a full scale perspective as far as what the organization believes in their perception, their goals, as far as how the website is serving them, and all the digital landscape is serving them. And then moving from there to group workshops. One thing that was really helpful with this is sort of we kind of, I like to throw workshops in the proposals as just that, workshop, and it doesn't give much more definition, because you kind of will learn from the first conversations where it's important to leverage that opportunity to bring a certain group of people together. And so when we're talking to the first set of stakeholders, you start to realize that some of these different departments have very clear differences of opinion, and I want to kind of get a collective voice about what their priorities are as separate groups. So when we're having workshops, it might be around bringing one group of all of their members together and bringing in more people who might not have been interviewed in order to hear what they believe, how they believe the website is supporting them. But then it also gives an opportunity for us to say, we heard some very interesting things in the interviews, and we need you guys to kind of have an opportunity to work through those differences of opinion together. And so it might be people from one group or an intentional cross-section across the group so that we can get people in the room and start doing some real consensus building around, what you actually think and how we kind of measure priorities. And then also doing surveys is making sure that we can take that 35 number, take the numbers that we expanded with the groups, and give a lot more people an opportunity to also provide feedback. Because one of the concerns that we always run into as well is, I want to make sure that people feel heard. And so when people get wind of the fact that this is happening, you start to see folks saying, well, why didn't they ask me? Why wasn't I in that meeting? Why didn't I get that interview? So looking for as many opportunities to make sure that people have a chance to get their opinions, their voice captured in anything that we're doing from a gathering of information standpoint. And then for the technical audit piece, Blake can talk a little bit about that.
The other part with, when we talk about any part of the key strategy is obviously understanding the technical requirements of that. And it starts in some forms of just understanding the process of it looks like for what it means for that agency to need to communicate what its day-to-day business. What does that look like? So we want to understand things in terms of the environment it is now, which we had a good background on, but also where they wanted to go. What did it look like to actually create an environment that could handle just one-touch publishing, basically, without clearing 17 different caches to get it out there to the public? These type of needs we had to get an understanding from them. I think a lot of us have found with some of our Drupal 7 sites and older that we just accept that it's going to take a while, that we're going to clear the whole cache and wipe it repeatedly to try to get it, and then curse when it doesn't show up when it's a key moment that it needs to get out there. So some of that what we had to do is really get a clear understanding of things that they've just accepted for a long time as being what it was like. And so that was helpful. It was informative to us. I think even as people who do maintenance on websites, we also forget that they're struggling every day sometimes and just not telling us. And so those technical intakes and the really working with the administrators, that gives us a view that it's often not about what the front end is. It's really just about, regardless of what happens to that content you're creating, how do you want to create it? Like, what does it look like? How do we make sure that the structure of those content types are valid and what you need in everyday aspects of what you're doing? We find a lot of times in the content types that are created, we just keep adding fields to them because, like, I need a thing to do this thing. And so a lot of that is trying to get a sense of what is the core element of a press release? What are those things that need to be in there? Where did we go off track? And so refocusing again what it means to communicate your day-to-day business and ensure that you're creating the tools you need to actually make sure you can do your job well.
And I think even just along that, the idea of talking to administrators, one of the things that's really important about engaging stakeholders first is that anything we recommend is only going to be as good as its ability to be maintained by the organization moving forward. And so if we don't focus in on the admin experience and on understanding what does it take to do publishing, how do you guys do content governance, what are the ways in which a piece of information gets put to the website today, and how might that be able to improve, then even the most beautiful user-friendly interface is only going to last as long as kind of the first round of content happens. Otherwise, you get slow updating or it becomes difficult to use. So we wanted to make sure that we understood that back-end process and the sort of human nature of it from an internal stakeholder standpoint as well, because those are actually users as well. And so them having to interact with the system was something that we also wanted to make sure we prioritized. And so something that's also important about stakeholder engagement piece is that it's much more important than just getting information. This is the first step in social buy-in. And so the fact that you have an opportunity, everybody, especially a lot of you guys are in the government, you see another consulting showing up and saying we're coming in to analyze and understand. Sometimes you look at it as, oh my God, this is a great opportunity for me to get my opinions heard and have whatever my process is improved. And sometimes you look at it and say, it seems like another group coming in to promise some things, and I've done this dog and pony show a couple of times, and it never really results in anything. So whatever the different stigma might be around who you are, why you're there, and what this entire process is about, giving them an opportunity to interact and get a one-on-one sort of relationship building chance with them, being able to meet as many stakeholders so when they see you in the next meetings, when you start to present designs and start to have other conversations, there's already been a little bit of some of the Band-Aid has been ripped off as far as who we are and why we're here to help, and you can kind of get that buy-in early. So every time you have an opportunity to do a touch point, it is a chance to build a relationship and make that stronger so that everything's successful moving forward. All right, so once we have basically done what we can to gather all the internal stakeholder information that we can, that really helps us inform. We analyze that and say, okay, what are the things that we heard? Where are the inconsistencies across conversations? Where are the very clear points where we need to analyze and put some real quantitative information behind what we heard? And just sort of say, what is their picture? What are they saying? And almost how do we either prove or disprove or just bring clarity to and context to some of the things that we heard them say? So relating the first stage with the internal stakeholder information to the second phase, which is now we need to do an entire audit of all of your analytics, your tracking, do a heuristics evaluation, and going through each of the different stages to really just sort of analyze the properties themselves as an in-between before we go into the user assessment work. And so in this case, this was also the point at which the team size grew tremendously. And so from our standpoint, it also was that the first section, you're really talking about maybe 5-person team where you can do some, 2 people doing interviews, somebody helping out with a workshop, developers present to help out with tech audits and things of that nature. But as we started to go to this level of an audit, especially when you're talking about 20 plus properties and a lot of different skill sets going into what these things are, this meant taking the team and changing it from what was 5 to about 15 or so, because you really wanted to make sure that experts had an opportunity to look at this stuff from their lens at kind of I just need you to take a look at the content and tell me if it's okay, regardless of the rest of the site. And so we're going to down the line of some of these things in case people aren't familiar with them. So the analytics baseline, this is really looking at what we have now and figuring out an opportunity to basically put a pin in it to say, what is your traffic? How many visitors? Where do they come from? What pages do they visit the most? How long do they stay on the pages? Getting all of the analytics data basically so that anything that we do moving forward, we can start there to say this is the thing that we're measuring against to figure out whether or not we've improved going back, forward or backwards, and what types of activities are going to push that needle. Reporting assessment is, while we're doing this analytics baseline and you might have a lot of things on your site, sometimes there's challenges with the ways in which reports are being created, communicated. Are you reporting on the right things? Are people in departments actually getting the information they need to impact the decisions they make in their job? So not just looking at the analytics for us to understand what a baseline is, but also looking at the way in which you are reporting information out to the necessary, whether it's department leads, heads, or administrators, in order to say, are they getting the actual right information out of those different reports that are going to allow them to make impactful decisions. UX heuristics evaluation is a usability audit on all of the sites across like a 10-point scale, basically to see whether or not the site is usable to users. That's a double. And that was something, again, so you're talking about 20 plus sites. We had to go through site by site and basically analyze each one of the pages in order to get an understanding for global challenges, things where navigation was inconsistent, where wording didn't make sense, this button push was not clear. I didn't understand that this was an opportunity to, that clicking this was going to result in that action, and this information was really out of order. I would have needed to see this first before I made this decision. So looking across all of the pages and really getting a sense of, from a usability standpoint, does this site make sense? Where would I have hangups? So content inventory and audit, that is literally just how we got to that 100,000 page view, which is running a crawl of all of the sites to get a sense of everything that we have and are working with, and kind of cleaning it up and organizing, because ultimately knowing where we're starting is going to help out with any of the different assessment. And so when we talk about the idea of any kind of consolidation, which is part of the goals of this, that doesn't happen unless we know first where we're starting. There might be 50,000 pages or documents that you could decide to do away with right away. So we had to do the inventory and then kind of audit that content in order to understand what was there. SEO audit, to understand what the tagging structure was like. How are they doing their breadcrumbing? Is it matching? Do they have the right headers on each one of the pages? Are they actually structuring their content in a way, writing in a way, are they that is going to make them findable on the topics that are important to them? And are they attacking the right topics? Sometimes people have are looking to get SEO terms or to take over SEO terms from a Google standpoint that are really, really popular ones that are very hard to compete with. So we also look to see whether or not there were opportunities to figure out which terms were most important for them to target based off of their needs. Site search assessment is how well is the search functioning. Basically, what kind of results do you get if you look for things, you type in something, what do you get? How clear is it? How much of the results weighted, organized, and some of that goes back to the sort of content structure, organization, and tagging standpoint, but getting a general global look at that piece. And then the brand and design audit was pretty fun because, again, 25 or 20 plus properties. Some of these were 3 or 4 were pretty similar, and the rest were completely hodgepodge. There was a game that was for kids, and it looked very different. There was a number of different sites that had basically some of which didn't seem to go through any version of a brand review or compliance check as far as what the organization's guidelines were, and then a comparative analysis to understand what other organizations were doing and basically how were you performing against what industry standards were in that case. And so as you can imagine, doing all of these things with almost separate individuals doing each one of those different audits, you could, in theory, just hand this back to the core team or to the main strategist that's responsible for doing it, but that would be a lot for them to figure out exactly how to analyze all of this information, make sense of it, places where that's not necessarily their technical expertise. So what we actually did was we held an internal, basically Regroup Power, where it was a 2-3 hour meeting, 20 people in the room, and it was almost like giving a presentation about what you've learned through your audit about this piece. So we went through each of the different 10 or so audits that we did, and each person basically had 7 or so slides that explained what the important details were, how they approached it, and what the information was that needed to be added. So we ended up with a document that ultimately had an entire kind of view of the analytics and the of the audit in one place, but it was really presented out. So we had an opportunity to make sure that everybody on the team got to hear that from kind of the expert's context and voice, as opposed to having to kind of make assumptions throughout it. And that's very important because otherwise, information can get lost in translation, and it's just handing it over a document that somebody might not necessarily pinpoint the most important pieces. 30. All right, and so then we really went into the audience and user research phase. And so something important about this piece is, a lot of this stuff we had to start planning for really day one, because I'm sure a lot of you dealt with OMB clearance, and so in order to be able to get approval for that and allow the project to keep going, we wanted to make sure that we had the survey script, we had the amount of users that we planned on doing, the focus group scripts. We had all of these things already planned for pretty much day one, even before we were 1,000% sure what it was going to be. We just needed to know enough of it written out so that we could put that in and get that approval and clearance, so that when it was time to actually perform the task, we were ready to go and start just with the recruitment and actually execute, as opposed to having to allow that delay to happen. So that was a very important part, because sometimes it takes weeks if somebody has a clearance that you're going to sort of piggyback on. Otherwise, it can take months, and that can be a really big delay. And a lot of times that's why our people find challenges with being able to talk to users, because there's a lot of red tape that you have to go through, and it can often mess up with the timeline internally. But so we were able to overcome that and perform 2 focus groups, which were very helpful with 12 participants each. Did an audience survey that was sent out through their social, and so leveraging your own channels in order to be able to recruit users from that standpoint. Task prioritization was basically sending out a list with basically 50 or so tasks that we just deemed to be the kind of tasks people wanted to perform across your platforms, and allowed them to pick their top 5. So we can get understanding that how to level the fact that while everybody believes that all of my tasks are important and everything, and whatever I'm controlling is what everybody wants, we looked for a way to, across all different audience types, kind of balance that out and prioritize things well. And then also a social listening exercise to get a sense of kind of what the voice was like outside of the organization from the ways in which they were communicating across the digital channels. And one of the biggest lessons learned or tips here is remembering that it's all information, so good or bad. And so focus groups, having a client sit in the room adjacent to listen in on focus groups while you ask people questions about their sites and the decisions they've made and whether or not it resonates, is not always a comfortable experience, but being able to level set and make sure that they understand that this is still very valuable, and being ready for preparing people in advance that what you're going to hear is not always going to be positive, but it's going to all be helpful as far as us getting to where we need to go in order to improve the organization. All right.
one of the things that speaks to, I think that's really important to emphasize, is that bringing the client into the process throughout is critical, right? And not only does that initial stakeholder engagement allow you to understand the organizational environment, the circumstances you're dealing with, strategic priorities, but it also allows you to identify people who are going to be your champions. We were lucky enough to be working with a primary point of contact, actually our core, who was a huge champion for this project. And that was critical to getting us off the ground in the first place. But bringing people in, having the federal employees sit in and observe the focus groups, we identified one individual who had a user experience background. She wasn't doing UX in her job at this agency, but we were able to bring her in to help with some of these activities. And all that does is give folks on the ground a sense of ownership over this project, and it helps address that concern that a lot of folks will have with a consultant coming in. I've never seen you before. You're just another management consultant coming in to tell me what to do. I know how to do my job best. Well, so much of this is about listening and about bringing people into the fold and making them feel a sense of ownership over the work as we go along. So as Jabali mentioned, we took a three-pronged approach. Number one, most important, was that stakeholder engagement, understanding the lay of the land, gaining buy-in. Number two was sort of a gap analysis. Okay, you've told us what your objectives are. You've told us whether it's working for you in actual implementation, administration, and publishing. Well, what are the results in the wild, right? What are analytics saying about whether you're reaching the audiences you intend to? Are you being effective with search engine optimization? Jabali mentioned SEO issues on some of these sites. The main site we dealt with, we actually found in our technical SEO audit, found 125,000 SEO issues. That's actually more issues than there are pages on that site. So just being able to identify, okay, where are the big issues happening? It's in metadata. All right, so that's going to be one of our top priorities, remediating metadata to make sure that people are finding the things they need to find when they're searching. Because what we found in our third step, that user engagement, was that users prefer to search. When they're looking for information that this agency produces, they're going first to Google, just like all of us do. But they also, we also learned that federal agencies, federal agency sites among this user group are the second most trusted source of information, and that was a key point for us to walk away with. But broadly speaking, what we found was that content strategy, content creation, and governance were the first major problem here. We've mentioned silos. 15 plus different sites, different offices running them. We had 2 different comm shops with 2 different web teams, both feeling like they had ownership over these topics. And that led to a lot of lack of clarity in accountability. And it also meant that there was plenty of duplication. Duplication is not only a major problem for search engine optimization. In effect, you're competing with yourselves. But it also is a huge waste of your time and resources. We had people, reproducing material on the same topics on 5 different sites when we could be producing one blog post that's just distributed on the right channels. What we also found was that all these issues led to a reactive culture that was more about quantity than quality content. We had over 110,000 pages on these sites. That sort of myopic focus on, I have to get my thing done. My job is to write blog posts. So the priority was write as many of these as I can. Never go back and look and see, did we publish something about this topic a year ago? All this makes evaluation and strategic planning really difficult. One of the things that we heard, though, across the board from our stakeholders on the ground was that they knew they had an important story to tell, and they knew they could do it better. You know, we've talked a lot about issues that we discovered, but there's a lot of enthusiasm among the people doing this work. You know, these are people who have devoted their lives to this agency's mission, and that's why it's so important to bring them into the process right away, to make them, you know, to give them an opportunity to feel like they're part of this team, that they're part of sort of rethinking the direction from a strategic standpoint. Another major challenge we ran into was that all this fragmentation was creating inconsistency in brand identities. We had users in our focus groups tell us that they couldn't even tell that one of the properties belonged to this agency. You know, some of the agency sites had a voice and tone and brand identity that felt official and USG, but there were others that weren't identifiably USG at all, let alone part of the agency. And it was creating confusion among users. It was adding to that problem of duplication. We also found across the board that because of the way the organization was structured, with individual units focusing on different audience groups, all the content was audience-oriented as well. And the challenge there is that demographic information is not necessarily what's going to help you reach your audiences best, right? When we're on the web, you know, websites are tools. They are tools for users to achieve tasks. And ultimately, what's most important is to look at what the tasks are that your audiences are trying to achieve. And in our analysis across the board, what we found is these siloed audience groups that the agency was thinking in terms of really had very similar task priorities. And it meant there was a huge opportunity for consolidation, for streamlining content, for streamlining strategic planning and operations. Just a quick quote from one of our focus groups. It looks like this agency hasn't figured out what their websites are for. And in many ways, that was the truth, right? That there were 15 different sets of priorities and goals and understandings of best practices rather than a single holistic digital strategy across the organization.
And so, so one of the things that's really important to note when Mark was talking about the idea of the user groups and the demographic information, one thing I always talk to people about is user personas. If anybody's ever had experience with them, they're great. They have an opportunity to really put a real sort of definition behind who each audience group is, and it gives you something to look for when you're thinking about when I'm creating something, who is this helping, who is this serving. But something that's definitely happened over time with a lot of the changes in just culture all around is that while a lot of the times that used to be a 18 to 35, mother of two, so on, so the information that you use in order to define that, the age ranges don't define behavior as much as they used to. When a person gets married, when they have children, all of those things, career-minded or not, like those things are very, very different across parts of the country, across just individual to individual, and so it's a lot harder to group people based off of some of the demographic information that might have worked 15 years ago or so, because the groups really said that meant if I'm in this age range, that means I'm probably at this stage of life and I've done these things, and it's not really as accurate anymore because there's a lot more flexibility and distinction about the ways in which people start to craft out their lives. So even that persona-based information, looking at ways to take that instead of saying age range, it's what are the actual points in life that you need to measure. Is a person career-minded? Are they a parent? Are they so-and-so? What are the things that actually might make them do different things? And going that stage deeper into that understanding of the audience as opposed to simply saying the demographic information and assuming that that comes with a certain certain set of assumptions. So as far as like how we went about sort of making recommendations for how they solve for some of these problems, one of them was to create a consistent, compelling brand identity rooted in storytelling. And so what this really speaks to is the idea that, you know, a lot of organizations, whilst they either have a very, very strict brand guidelines when it comes to websites, which says you can only put this header up top and do so and so, but when it actually talks about, doesn't really go as deep into saying what is our voice, how do we talk, you know, what are the plain language standards, what reading level should each of your different everything that you write be at. And so there are much more things that go into it that really are helpful guides as opposed to limitations. So what we wanted to really do was give them an opportunity to shift their interpretation of their brand and how it translated in the web in this day and age into something that was actually guidelines for the ways in which they were able to communicate appropriately that was in the tone of the organization consistently across the board, and showed them where there was flexibility within it as well. And that storytelling component was also thinking about the idea that, especially because a lot of people are coming to your site from Google, right? And so if anybody's been part of a website redesign, you've been through that phase where it's like, start with the homepage. It's the most important part. And people fight over what image or what's going to be in that top scroller, or what's going on the homepage, and where's priority. This is the priority location. The reality is, if somebody is coming to your site from Google, which is what most of us do these days, is you might enter on page whatever 55. You're going to look for your content, and you're going to come into the site through a side door as opposed to directly through the front. And so recognizing that, what you have to do from a standpoint of capturing conversion, which is catching audiences wherever they land and being able to provide information to show value of what else the organization offers and how you could serve them more, means that your pages need to be a little bit more robust. Looking for opportunities to tell a compelling story on each of the, especially the major landing pages that are topic-based, to say, when I come to this section about this topic, I want to be able to get a general high-level understanding of what I can do, provide them a little bit more context, and provide them with related content in order to start to send them out to different parts of your site so they can explore deeper. So looking for ways to create more compelling storytelling pages that recognize the fact that people are coming here with a need, and they might not be coming through your beautiful, wonderful front door that says exactly where people should go and gives you access to all these things, but instead any major landing page might be important for them to know what else is possible throughout the site.
The other thing I want to mention there is that that storytelling doesn't have to be complicated, right? The most important thing here is simply to tell people who you are. And this is an issue we run into with our federal clients nearly across the board, right? There's an understandable aversion to the idea that maybe talking about ourselves is boasting or bragging or too self-absorbed, and we're here to serve the public, so what's the use in talking about ourselves? But the bottom line is, when people show up on your site, they don't know who the heck you are. They may not understand what that acronym means. They may not understand what your mission really is, or they may have a false idea. I mean, in this particular case, there's a lot of confusion between the agency we're working with and an agency with a similar acronym. And there were sites in this ecosystem that had zero about content on them at all. So simply including a mission statement, a readable, plain language, easy to understand and digest, here's who we are and what we do, on your front page, across the site, it goes a long way toward helping people feel like you are someone they can trust.
And this really speaks to, I mean, we talked about it around the personas, but then more importantly, organizing by task. One of the things, again, this organization was very, very driven both from the navigation, from how people spoke about it internal, to say that they divided their audiences by job title, basically, career or whatever, and we're like, only these people need these things. And so in part of our research, we asked people to identify with one of the titles that they understood them to be, and then did the rest of the survey. And so when we were analyzing, we said, well, how do people respond across the different job titles? We learned very quickly that if I come in and I'm a doctor, that doesn't mean I'm also not a citizen at certain times. And so I can, even though I do that at work, I have a lot of other needs and reasons to come to your site that might not be related to my job function. And so what we got was that people were not aligned. There was not a lot of differentiation as far as what people were trying to accomplish on sites based off of that distinction. And so changing it from being organized by distinction into instead being organized by the task people were trying to create, and making that very clear for them to understand. All right, there you go. Next.
I've been told I sometimes talk fast, so I'll talk fast. So the one thing we found was that clearly the way to provide the best sense of governance for them was to get them into a single consolidated information hub, a single point that allowed us to create, for one, a consistent administrative experience for them, but at the same time a place where they really lack the ability to create as much duplicative content. They can find what's been created before. They're all looking in the same resources in terms of media and same resources in terms of content, be able to locate things that they've had previous discussions about they need to update, and also a governance that says, okay, when this thing's about, who's writing it, who's leading it, how do we share it? If something needs to be written for the main blog post that, or press release that is a bit more formal, how do we attach it to that same content in a plain language version that can be displayed through a request of somewhere else? So trying to find a centralized environment. In this case, our recommendation, of course, is moving into Drupal 8. By the time it's done, we may be at Drupal 11. But the idea of getting a centralized hub. And the modernization of that is obviously they're in a group of sites now that are Drupal 7 multi-sites, trying to get them centralized in an environment of within a single CMS of Drupal 8 and utilizing services functionalities built into that to find ways to serve content out to different audiences as needed, but from a centralized location. Try to remove the instinct to say, oh, I must need another multi-site if I have a new audience. So trying to find a centralized environment for that. This is just a little bit of like sort of what I think we've all seen in some ways, is that we've got multiple sites where we have editors, publishers, and managers. There's a complex workflow, logging into all kinds of different sites and trying to create content, and then serving those out to what we think is the audience that's needed for each one. The recommended structure looks a little bit more something like this, which is where we have a single authenticated workflow, a content management flow that is consistent, that's got a governance policy behind it that is really, this is what it looks like for us to move content from draft to review to published. That we agree as a whole agency from the CIO department, everyone, that this is what is secure, this is what is appropriate to ensure our message is delivered appropriately. The idea is that we put that in a content repository, no longer tied to just to a Drupal theme that just come out of. Instead, having the ability to serve custom content that just comes out in the raw format through the API for audience needs if necessary. If you need a site that is only for a particular audience type, or a landing page, or an issue that you have an issue page, finding a way to make that request through an API request for that content, and creating an experience that hopefully is branded and appropriate, but separate from the theme layer and creating more flexibility. So we can have a main site that's got a theme, but also providing content in a more flexible way from a centralized repository.
So that's Clay mentioned governance, right? That's the real organizational challenge here. It's coordinating strategic planning. And what we saw was that, I mentioned earlier, there were multiple offices that were all responsible for web properties, web management, for communications. And the problem was simply that conversations just weren't happening, right? There might be one meeting, there was a monthly meeting, I believe, where the directors of these offices would update one another, but the teams, and on the other hand, the teams on the ground, the actual publishers were coordinating amongst themselves, but they were having to create those working relationships and those structures ad hoc and whole cloth, right? There was no sort of coordinated strategy. So one of the things we recommended was implementing a governance committee, a strategic planning committee that just creates the space for those conversations to happen. Folks don't have to agree on the priorities if we can at least have the space to hash out what we're doing today, what we're doing over the next week, and to sort of negotiate those priorities together. And the other important element there is to tie everything back to key performance indicators, to have a set of measurements that tell us what success means to all of us, so that we can always turn back to that and say, okay, is this going to move us forward? Is this going to help us achieve our objectives or not? Or is this just busy work, and should we move on?
Okay, so after doing all that, and this is only 2 more slides, I will wrap up. Is a lot of this was, okay, once we have these findings and once we have this information and we've communicated this back, like how do we actually get it done? And one of the most important pieces here was recognizing that, okay, we're saying a lot of stuff. This is going to impact a lot of people, and there's going to be a lot of actual concern about what is going to happen if you do this to my job. And some of the key concerns were, loss of control. If you're talking about content governance, you're talking about one committee, and I used to be able to just publish all my own stuff on all my own sites and all my own way. What happens if you do that? And so what we talked about was with the governance committee, that actually gives you a voice to continue to have that same opportunity to dictate what's important and prioritize to you, but you can do it where you actually have support from other groups in order to help deliver on your priorities. Whether or not the audience get I can't read that. Deprioritize audiences, and just recognizing that actually making things task-based will make it easier for each audience to find their content. Doesn't mean they have to be the biggest thing on the block, but you put them in the right places on the site, and actually it means everybody's actually been prioritized because they've been targeted in the right way. And the lack of flexibility, allowing from a design standpoint for campaign sites if necessary, allowing for some brand expansion will actually give you more flexibility as opposed to just simply the ability to go completely out. And then the concern that basically internal priorities would be very unilaterally focused. So if you give all control over to one head at the top, that they would only think about one audience. And the reality is these conversations would allow for more, for them to actually focus on a much more broader strategy and everybody's voices to be heard and considered in that. And all of those things really ladder back to what the real goals were of the Idea Act is, what you're trying to accomplish and what the hope is to make things so the user needs are addressed and that internal delivery strategy for the organizations are also pieces that the agency is able to to execute. And beyond that, it became a matter of how do we actually continue to ensure that this information, that these sites are being improved upon. And so creating basically iterative testing process, which was like a 90-day cycle that included a certain amount of time in order to allow analytics to review, quarterly setting priorities for the organization and say, what are we trying to accomplish, measure, what initiatives do we have coming up that are important for us to know that are going to impact our digital strategy, and how do we basically have that something that the organization is doing on a consistent basis so that not only does it allow for constant improvement, but it also creates a culture internally of being used to the idea of being strategic, targeted, and continuously improving your sites based off of your needs, both from a user standpoint and from a business standpoint. All right, that was the quick wrap up. All right, thank you very much. Any questions?
Any questions for us?
Sure.
Are you always able to get OMB clearance? And if not, how do you address that? We get the guidance that it's just too hard to do.
Right.
We can do user testing with 9 users, and we work for scientists who then proceed to tell us that our findings are not legitimate.
Right. Right. So the first thing I'll say is that OMB clearances are agency specific, right? That it's going to be agency dependent. It's really going to be dependent on the team within your agency that is clearing those requests and their practices and habits. So the first thing, when you're facing that sort of scenario, I'd recommend is building relationships with those people, right? We all know, working for a federal agency is really a matter of building relationships, and in this case, that's absolutely true. The second thing is to plan far in advance. With this particular agency, we were lucky enough to face a situation where the agency was requesting a certain number of studies with a certain number of people, 2 or 3 years in advance. So we had a bucket we could already use, right? And there's a cadence there that makes those things available before we know we even need them. But the last thing is, there are other things you can do to find the information you're looking for. And it's challenging when you're facing a social scientist who will say this isn't statistically significant. But you're not necessarily always looking for statistically significant information. What you're looking for is clues. You're looking for context clues. What do I need to dig into further? What issues come up here that I might be able to explore further in the analytics? Or, are there other methods I can use to speak to stakeholders who could perhaps, provide a lot of the same context that a user might?
Yeah, I think we have to wrap up. So we'll be around. We have a booth upstairs, the U Group booth. So stop by if you have any other questions for us and get our contact information. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.